Now, joining us on the program right now, Dave Coble, the research director at the Independence Institute in Colorado. Dave, good evening, sir.
Good evening, and I just think in the interest of full disclosure, you should say that frequently the NRI News crew goes out to the Department of Motor Vehicles and hangs out
We
for a
do.
while after the show.
Always. I mean, you know, it's every morning, actually. We don't do it because they close, but every morning we have our morning meeting there. We just hang out, and, yeah, it's great. Love the DMV. Hey, I thought this was fascinating. It's another story about the Mexican drug cartels that's not really being reported here in the United States, but in the Latin America Herald Tribune. I believe the Latino section of Fox News had a story on this as well. It turns out, Dave, that according to a diplomatic cable that was released by WikiLeaks, the, quote, most fearsome weapons wielded by Mexico's drug cartels enter the country from Central America, not the United States.
Right, and that's it's actually several diplomatic cables that are part of this WikiLeaks thing. And it says it says in particular, it's about 90% of the heavy weapons.
Mm-hmm.
It's not talking; these are not referring to firearms,
Right?
But grenade launchers and things like that. And it says basically they're stolen from military armories in Central America, and then brought over the border. And as the cables also point out, the Mexican government doesn't put much effort into controlling its border with Guatemala. I mean, we know that that's how they deal with the United States, but that's also true with Guatemala. It says that they've got a 577-mile border and 125 immigration officials for that entire long border.
That's amazing. As the cable points out, there are 30,000 U.S. Customs and Border Protection officers on the 1,926-mile Mexico-U.S. border. 125.
We've got one for every mile of border. We've got 15 officers.
Yeah, and they've got 125 officials monitoring the 577-mile border with Guatemala.
Right, so about fewer than one officer for every 4 miles.
Good gracious. That it's not surprising, Dave, that is the case because again we've kind of known. I mean, you see these stories of as you say, grenade launchers, anti-tank missiles, grenades, RPGs turning up increasingly in the cartels, and we know they're not getting them from gun stores here. But that's sort of where the focus has been, and there have been plenty of news stories over the past couple of years that will reference grenades and RPGs and things of that nature, and then in the next paragraph talk about the quote-unquote lax gun laws here in the U.S.
Right, and they give readers the false impression that Mexican cartels are walking up to gun shows in Arizona and buying grenade launchers. Yeah.
Now, as you say, the cables do say that a majority of the handguns and rifles they say are still coming from the United States.
Right, especially handguns. They're a little more equivocal on so-called assault rifles, and actually, to the extent that, and again, this reinforces a point that we've been making and lots of folks at NRA have been making, that the fact that you see a Kalashnikov assault rifle in the hands of a Mexican cartel, again, doesn't mean it necessarily came from the United States. We know now for sure that military armories are supplying the Mexican cartels in quite significant numbers. So it may well be that a lot of the military rifles they have are actual military rifles stolen from militaries in Central America and not guns bought over the counter in the United States. And of course, as you and the listeners of this program know, but a lot of folks don't, you can't buy a machine gun in this country over the counter.
Right. Yeah, well, and I think our audience is up on that. I hope so, anyway.
Yeah.
But there are two other areas though of concern that I don't know were mentioned in these cables at all. But one, the guns that are actually being taken from the deserters in the Mexican army when they go to work for the cartels, because we know that that's happening.
And that's a huge problem, and they've got a very high desertion rate in the Mexican army, and of course Las Zetas. One of the most violent of all the gangs was actually founded by deserters from Mexican special forces.
Right, exactly. And then the other thing is this international, you can call it the international black market or the international gray market for arms. We know that these cartels, I mean, they're multinational criminal enterprises. We've seen stories about how they acquire the chemicals that they use to make methamphetamine, and it involves, utilizing other individuals in places like China and India and in the Gulf states in the Middle East to get these chemicals to Mexico, where they can be used to help manufacture methamphetamine. Dave, it seems kind of silly to think that these criminal enterprises don't have criminal connections in the international black market for arms as well.
Of course, and I mean, how could they possibly not? And there is, as you say, a large international market in black arms, and an important part of it is guns from former Warsaw Pact countries and other weapons besides guns that are now all over the place in Africa, among others. And of course, the Chinese military is and companies affiliated with it is one of the largest suppliers of firearms to warlords and other bad guys in the world. And then the Mexican cartels, with their enormous amount of money, have access to all kinds of sources of illegal guns. So even if you actually built the fence that Congress says ordered be built, and which President Bush and President Obama have basically refused to build, and really stopped all smuggling in both directions across the U.S.-Mexico border, there would still be an enormous supply of firearms for the cartels having nothing to do with the United States.
Absolutely. I think, again, this goes back to the idea that this is not a problem related to our gun laws here in the United States, but it really is a border problem, not only for the U.S., but for Mexico as well.
Well, and it's, in a sense, an inevitable price of the illegalization of drugs. I mean, when you make a commodity illegal that a lot of people want to buy and will pay a premium for, then there's a lot of money to be made in smuggling that product. And you could put the cartels out of business tomorrow by returning the United States to the kind of drug laws we had in 1905, as opposed to the ones we have now, and you could take a huge chunk out of their profits by legalizing marijuana and regulating it the same way alcohol is regulated.
Yeah. Now, speaking of commerce, Dave, I want to ask you about a piece that you had published at National Review, or I'm sorry, in the National Law Journal. Health insurance is not commerce, you say.
In the original understanding of the Constitution, which the Supreme Court, in this case, followed until 1944, and then wrote an opinion which seemed to be based on original sources, but when you look at it, none of them really support the claim of that opinion. And that's right. It was that the original understanding was that commerce, when you're talking about that in a legal sense, it includes buying and selling of goods across state lines, but it's not only that. It's also some things that are closely related to commerce, commercial paper, for example, or navigation. But it did not include insurance. There were all kinds of economic activities, many of which had interstate effects. The founders were perfectly aware of interstate effects. But not every business which has an interstate effect was considered to be commerce in the sense that Congress could regulate it under the power to regulate commerce among the several states. And insurance was one of those things that, by definition, was not regulable interstate commerce.
Yeah. Well, again, folks can find this at davekopel.org. It is a fascinating article, and I mean, obviously, this has, you'd like to think anyway, Dave, it would have big considerations as we gear up for the Supreme Court hearing Obamacare.
Well, I think it's we wrote more for even though we said the Supreme Court should overrule this 1944 case called Southeastern Underwriters, I think it's unlikely the court is going to go that far. I think they can take care of the Obamacare mandate without having to overrule any of their past precedents, including the ones that have had very expansive interpretations of the interstate commerce power. But in the long run, we can influencing the public debate is one of the ways that you influence the Supreme Court in the long run, as the NRA is a good exemplar of doing that effectively, of finally convincing the Supreme Court that it was worthwhile looking at the Second Amendment carefully and then interpreting the Second Amendment according to the original meaning.
Yeah. Well, Dave, thanks again, sir, for joining us tonight. It's always a real pleasure getting a chance to talk with you.
Okay. Thanks for having me.
Dave Kopel, Research Director at the Independence Institute here on Cam & Company.